In this unit, we're talking about educational systems around the world, and we're focusing on the study of comparative and international education. Now, one thing you'll notice, especially in the first few pages of this chapter, is that understanding and comparing educational systems around the world is complex. Think back to the last couple of units of the course where we looked at the influences of the external environment on education. With comparative studies in education, it's a whole new ballgame. There are even more environmental influences that vary widely from one society to another. Take a look at the first couple of pages of the chapter, where Ballantyne and Hammock use a couple of vignettes to illustrate the differences between education in the developed world and education in the developing world. Think about the effect just that the economy has in these cases. Forget political influences, parental support, the specific curriculum being studied, and all that stuff just for a second, and just consider what a tremendous difference there is in education between nations who have industrial and commercial economies and nations that have largely agrarian economies. Okay, then you're going to move on to some of the theoretical perspectives behind comparative education. And again, you'll be reading about functionalist perspectives versus conflict perspectives. As Ballantyne and Hammock note, neither of these should be considered the one and only correct way of analyzing education. They are different lenses through which different questions can be examined. So some of those perspectives that you'll read about include the human capital perspective. This is looking at education as a factor in contributing to economic growth. Just like you have capital that you invest in a business, like money or land or technology, the human capital perspective says that humans are also an investment in the economy. And so if you want to improve that resource, so to speak, you invest in it through education. You'll also read about the legitimation of knowledge perspective, which is a conflict theory perspective that looks at how what we know becomes legitimized in our society. In other words, widely accepted, and how what we know has changed over time depending on who is in power in the society. Another perspective you'll read about is world systems analysis. This is another conflict perspective where the basic relationship between the haves and the have-nots is characterized by core nations and periphery nations. The core nations have economic control and political power in the world system, and thus they also control the type of education and knowledge that is disseminated to the periphery. Now, the periphery nations fully believe that if they work hard enough, they can become part of the core nations. So they buy into the education and knowledge being disseminated by the core in order to learn and become a part of that elite group. Obviously, there are exceptions to these kinds of national behaviors, but that's what makes the study so interesting. These researchers want to understand who buys into the core nation's values and who doesn't, and why that is, of course. Okay, the rest of the chapter focuses on topics that we've already studied from a U.S. perspective, but they're expanded on to understand education in the global community. So, comparisons by race, class, gender, family background, interinstitutional linkages, and environmental influences on education, the influences of politics and economics on educational decisions. And this last point is particularly interesting, I think, because now we're not looking at strictly the influence of capitalist economic thinking, like we have in the U.S. on education. Instead, this section also looks at education in nations that have strict socialist governments and also democratic socialist governments. And lastly, there's also a section on higher education around the world, definitely worth checking out. So take a look, give the chapter a good read through. Remember that we have a discussion forum and a quiz in this unit. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel now, only 2 more units to cover after this one. Have a great week.